A group of children, all of about the same age, but their age is all thing they have in common. Some are active, some are social, some reserved. Some are already interested in girls and some are not. As Emerson said, nature never rhymes her children nor makes two men alike. But they differ not only in physical appearance or social behavior. We all pride ourselves on our ability to judge people, but can you pick out one among them who might be truly extraordinary? No one could, merely by looking at them. But there are methods by which it is possible to make certain predictions about them, and that is what is being attempted now. I'm John Darley. Psychology is the science that studies man's behavior. And one important branch of psychology is the study and measurement of individual differences by means of psychological tests. This is one of my fingerprints. And these are other fingerprints, none of them mine. For over 80 years, police all over the world have been collecting and comparing fingerprints, and so far, no two of them are alike. Some of the ways in which we differ from each other are as obvious as the differences in our fingerprints. Others are much less obvious and less easy to measure. These are the ways we feel about ourselves and others, and the ways we think, the manner and level of our thinking that determines what we are able to do. These children are about to take a test which will select the most intelligent among them. And those, the exceptional ones, will go into a special class where one aspect of their thinking, their ability to think creatively, will be studied. This study is one of many being carried out at the University of Illinois, where the head of the psychology department is Dr. Lloyd Humphreys.
As Dr. Darley said, these children are taking an intelligence test. The first test of this type, the first successful attempt to measure significant individual differences, also involved children. This was the test developed by Alfred Binet in 1905 to determine which children were intelligent enough to benefit from education and which should not be required to go to school. The first mass use of this type of test occurred in World War I, when the Army Alpha was developed to screen recruits and to select the best candidates for officer training. The greatest advance in psychological testing, however, occurred in World War II. Our greatest need immediately after Pearl Harbor was, of course, the selection and training of the best possible men to man the highly specialized jobs of pilot, bombardier, and navigator. We had plenty of men who wanted to fly, and we had more men who had graduated from high school and college than any other country in the world. But the Army Air Forces discovered this did not mean that they could all learn to fly. When pilot candidates were unselected, only about 25% were able to complete their training satisfactorily and qualify as pilots. What could be done? Psychologists were called in and asked to devise a series of tests that would predict more accurately whether or not a man could be trained as a pilot. To be able to do this would save not only lives and time, but millions of dollars as well, since fewer air bases, instructors, and training planes will be required. We began by studying typical intellectual and academic tests, which were paper and pencil tests. We also tried available apparatus tests. However, the first test tried couldn't do the job, so after eliminating all but a few of them, we began devising a new set of tests. We knew by now that intelligence alone, at least academic intelligence, wasn't enough to make a pilot. Well, what did? The way to find out was to analyze what a pilot had to do. This would tell us what special qualities or aptitudes were required. So some psychologists began going through pilot training themselves. Now, one of the ways in which flying differs from most anything else man does is that it involves motion through 3 dimensions instead of 2. Therefore, spatial orientation, the ability to orient yourself in those 3 dimensions, is important. One apparatus test already in use that measured this ability to some extent, and which we continued to find useful, was the complex coordination test. Here the candidate sits before the stick and rudder bar and responds appropriately to the changing patterns of lights on the panel in front of him. This apparatus tested his reactions to complex cues and required coordinated movements of the controls. However, his ability to orient himself in space was critically dependent on his ability to interpret instrument readings, that is, to recognize the orientation of his plane from readings on the instrument panel. This sounds obvious, but in the early stages of our work, we didn't realize how large individual differences in this ability were. This immediately suggested a visual, pictorial test in 2 parts that we called instrument comprehension. In part 1, after an explanation of the purpose of the 6 instruments used in flying a plane, the candidate was asked to pick out the correct description of what the plane was doing from a reading of the instruments. A second part of the test showed only 2 instruments, and by reading them, the candidate had to pick the position the plane was in from the accompanying photographs. This completely new test, requiring no apparatus, was found to have extremely high validity and became one of the most useful we devised. Another related test, also of great value, was the stick and rudder orientation test. Here the candidate was given 3 successive photographs of the ground as seen from the cockpit of a plane during a simple maneuver, and had to mark the answer sheet to show the position of the stick and rudder in making the maneuver. These were only a few of the tests we developed, for the entire battery consisted of more than 20 tests. The results were extremely satisfactory. As I have said, when unselected candidates were allowed to enter pilot training, only about 25% of them were graduated. But at the end of only 9 months, we had devised tests that reversed these figures. For when the group was selected for the tests we had developed, between 70 and 75% qualified as pilots. In other words, we had done exactly what the Air Force had asked us to do. The great success of the specialized tests developed during World War II led to a tremendous growth in civilian use of these tests following the war. Some of these are useful in vocational guidance and counseling in the schools. Others are used in industrial personnel work. Differential aptitude tests are a proven value in our society today. We are still working, however, on the further development of intellectual tests, which brings us back to these children. Here you see them taking a group intelligence test, the Lord's Thorndike. Based on their scores, the top 10% of their age group are selected. With such a group of high-scoring children, we now want to investigate certain additional aspects of their intellectual behavior. We want to find ways of increasing and measuring creative or productive thinking in the classroom. To reach this goal, new teaching and measurement methods will be introduced, as you will soon see. Conducting these studies here at the Institute for Research on Exceptional Children at the University of Illinois is Dr. James Gallagher.
During the past decade, many psychologists have become interested in other dimensions of intelligence beyond those measured by standard instruments as the Lord's Thorndike. Since some of these dimensions are related to creative abilities, they are of particular interest to those of us who work in an educational setting. We can define intelligence in any one of a number of different ways. One such definition could be that intelligence is the sum total of those mental processes which enable us to collect and store information and use the information to adapt to our environment. But any such definition is only as good as the tools that we use to measure it. It is the development of these new measuring instruments that broaden our view of the intellect. The classification system we use includes 4 major categories of thought processes that we've adopted from J.P. Guilford's structure of intellect. In addition, we use a number of other categories which include teacher approval and disapproval that we're interested in. This is a class in social studies. As you can see, everything that goes on here is recorded on tape. In addition, observers take notes on the proceedings which are integrated into the final script. We are interested in cataloging the flow of productive thought in classroom interchanges like this as a first step to improving educational procedures. Let's listen.
Today I'd like to look at the Spanish Armada itself. What was the Spanish Armada? Scott?
A fleet of ships King Philip sent out from Spain to declare war upon England.
That's right.
Now the question that was just asked, what was the Spanish Armada, calls for one of the simplest of mental processes, cognitive memory. Here the student only has to go to his storehouse of facts and pick out the right answer. Let's see what others we get.
So you can see this was serious business. Spain was going to invade England. Now why do you think King Philip would take a step like this? Why was there conflict between Spain and England? Becky?
Well, first of all, there was a difference in religion between Spain and England, and some English pirates had robbed cargo off of some of the Spanish ships, and Spain was mad about this, and they were debating on who would get the upper hand to settle the New World.
This question called for convergent thinking, an operation which involves the analysis and integration of given data. Because of the structure and the way in which the teacher presented the question, only one right answer is possible.
Now suppose for a moment that the Spanish Armada had not lost its battle in the English Channel. Suppose that Drake and the other English captains were off somewhere else with most of the fleet, or the storm had never come up, which dashed the remains of the Spanish fleet on the shore. What then do you think would have been the results? Bob?
Well, the whole of North America might have belonged to Spain. Canada, United States, and Mexico might not have been divided. And if we did fight a revolution with them, we might have lost it.
That's certainly right. Any other ideas on this? Dan?
Well, we might not have as much freedom of religion as we have now, and our political freedom wouldn't be the same. And we wouldn't be as strong a nation because at the moment, Spain isn't a very strong nation at all. And if we were under their rule, I doubt that we would be either.
All right.
That last question called for divergent thinking, a mental operation that seems related to creative abilities. In this situation, as you saw, the student is free to produce unique and original ideas.
Do you think we're better off today because England won this war and Spain lost? May?
Well, I definitely think that we are better off that England won. Just look at the United States now. It's so well off, and I don't see what England could have done to support the United States better. After all, England had a lot of natural resources, agricultural crops, and manufacturing industries. And also the English were, they wanted to settle in one place when the Spanish just wanted to own more parts of the North American continent.
That's right. Are there any other opinions? Joan?
Well, I agree with May. Spain was more interested in money and probably would have taken some of the resources back to Spain. And I think a better free choice of religion is better.
Dan?
I disagree. Both Spain and England had state religions and absolute monarchies. And I think we would have become independent anyway because all the South American countries that Spain had did, and Spain was better situated for colonizing the West. Its colonies were anyway, because it had South America for supplying the Gulf Coast and Mexico for expansion along the Southwest.
Joan?
Well, if we hadn't won the revolution, we might be under dictatorship now.
Yes, I think if we had lost a revolt against Spain, this would be very likely.
This last question calls for evaluative thinking, which deals with dimensions of value. In this situation, the student must construct a dimension of goodness and then determine whether Spain or England most adequately fits that concept of goodness. At the end of the classroom session, the tape recordings are transcribed. This tape script is given to one of our analysts who classifies the verbal performances according to the categories I've already mentioned. By summing the performance of the students and teacher over 5 consecutive class sessions, we can look at some consistent patterns of thought. When the tape script has been analyzed and marked, the results are entered on a flow chart which gives us a quick and graphic picture of what took place in the classroom. Here in a typical flow chart, you can see how little divergent or evaluative thinking there was in comparison to the other thought processes. Only 1 or 2 responses here reflect productive as opposed to memory work. Naturally, the spoken word is only one aspect of intellectual performance. We've been using a number of experimental tests to measure their written productive ability. In addition, we give these students tests of attitude and personality and also collect information from their families in order to relate these factors to productive ability in the classroom. One of these experimental tests, consequences, has been used in a number of research projects throughout the country. This is administered as a written test, but for purposes of an illustration, we will show you some students responding to it orally.
All right. Do you understand the test?
Yes, I'm supposed to tell you whatever I think of and as much as I think of, and there aren't any right or wrong answers.
That's right. Anything that you think of that would answer the question is all right.
Oh, okay.
Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go. I'll record your answers. All right. Tell me, what do you think would happen if everyone lived to be 200 years old?
Well, they're always talking about the population explosion, and I guess it'd be a lot worse. Let's see, well, I don't know, George Washington would just have died about 30 years ago. The Earth would be a lot more crowded, and I imagine old age pensions would start about 100 years later. There'd probably be just more of everything to accommodate the people. Because, let's see, I don't know, they say we're increasing at, oh, I don't know, something like 28 million in this last decade. And if everybody lived to be 200 years old, we'd probably have a lot more people. I don't know anything else I can think of. I guess that's all.
All right, Tim. What do you think would happen if it rained 6 months out of every year in Illinois?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I guess, well, maybe the sale of raincoats would go up. But, well, I'm not really, I guess it'd all depend on what 6 months it rained as to crops. If it rained, if you sort of divided it up and put a little bit of rain in when it's usually dry and took away a little bit when it's usually wet, it'd probably be better for crops. But if it all came at one time, it could drown them and just sort of put the whole thing out. I guess if it was divided up and for a solid 6 months it just rained, and then for a solid 6 months it was just hot sunshine. During that'd give us probably more summer, 6 months of hot weather, and swimming pools would be more popular, I imagine. Well, more popular longer, and there'd be more sale of summer clothing, and either kids would have a shorter school year or they'd just have to go to school during the summer. That's about all, I guess.
All right. Tell me what you think would happen if everyone were born with only 3 fingers and no thumb.
Well, I imagine, first of all, the shapes of all things that we hold, pencils and pens and knives, silverware, anything like that, it would be shaped differently for our use. Well, it'd be a lot harder to grasp things, and in that way I imagine we wouldn't have advanced this far in manufacturing and different hand-skilled crafts. And, let's see, all handles would be built differently. And, well, I don't know, manicurists would have an easier time.
This boy showed a number of indications of superior ability on this test. First, he saw right away that all of the things that he would have to pick up would be changed. Second, he talks in terms of solutions as well as problems. He talks about the handle that needs to be modified. Third, he gives a wide variety of responses to the question. And finally, he gives us some humor in terms of the response about the manicurist. And humor seems to be related to productive thinking ability. Let's take a look at the same test taken by another student.
Well, if everyone lived to be 200 years old, then there would be no real young people. I mean, the population would be too awful, and there'd be too many people in the world, and food and water would be a great problem. But the older people could help the younger people remember some of the things that their grandmothers taught them, and they know more than they ever had because they can't write everything down. And the family secrets can be passed on, and then more people could learn about the secrets for rockets and missiles, and they could go to other planets and inhabit them, and they would have no fear of people dying off if they had to live to be 200. And there'd be an awful unemployment because there wouldn't be as many jobs, and there'd be more people to do them, so there wouldn't be as many jobs available. And they could probably think of a lot more things to do, but that still wouldn't make up for it.
What do you think would happen if everyone were born with only 3 fingers and no thumb?
Well, that'd be awful because they couldn't grasp things with their hands because the thumb really has an importance, and they'd have to limit the weight to the things they lift, and they could not lift their own weight like some people do. And when they write, it's not going to be too good at all. And lots of instruments won't be able to be played, and there won't be bands and orchestras, and a lot of jobs will have to be eliminated.
This girl gave some perfectly respectable answers to the test, but they're not quite the same quality as that of the boy. She was a little more specific in her responses. She talked about problems rather than solutions, and she didn't have as wide a variety of responses as the boy. On our scores of flexibility and fluency, the boy would probably come out a little bit better. Our research seemed to point to the fact that many people have felt before but have not documented, and that is that the teacher is the key to the initiation and stimulation of productive thinking in the classroom.
Let us go back to the teacher and watch him build to a divergent thinking sequence concerning trends towards nationalism.
Now, we've looked at the national power structure that existed when colonial America emerged. Let's look at the present situation now. What would you say are the leading world powers today? Dave?
I would think that the United States and Soviet Russia would be.
And why has the center of power started to shift away from the western part of Europe today?
Because there are a lot of resources within these boundaries to be developed.
But Western Europe is loaded with resources. Is this the only reason?
Well, Western Europe is divided up into many countries, and these have to share all their resources, and there are feud sometimes. They can't get together to develop them.
All right, then they're trying to solve this problem with the common market today. Do you have anything to add, Greg?
Well, yes. Modern communications and transportation will let other countries develop a high standard of living, too.
So you might say the colonial powers were victims of their own policy. Now, what changes in this old world of ours would you foresee if this trend towards nationalism continues? Alan?
Well, there will be more independent countries, and they will take a bigger part in the UN and the freedom of other countries. And Russia will have more satellites and communist countries under its control.
Does the older system of colonialism give the underdeveloped peoples of the world more opportunity? Alan?
Well, it would give them a better start, and after a while, they wouldn't want another country ruling over them.
I agree. I think that a country would not like someone overseas to be ruling because they would think that they wouldn't know what was happening right then and know what to do about it.
As we have seen, unless the teacher asks for certain kinds of thinking operations and deliberately encourages them, they rarely occur in the classroom. This seems to be particularly true of divergent thinking. This is a graph of a social studies class which shows the percentage of divergent thinking produced by the teachers and the students over 5 class sessions. As you can see, there's a close relationship between the performance of the teacher and the pupils. As the teacher is reasonably high in divergent thinking, the pupil's production is high. As the teacher's production drops, so does the students. Particularly here, you see the teacher has increased in divergent thinking in his 3rd class session, and you can see how high the percentage of divergent thinking was in the students. When the teacher dropped down again in the divergent production, you can see that the students are down here at a low level. Now, this is the kind of analysis through which we hope to find out what kinds of teacher behavior actually stimulate various kinds of productive thinking in the part of the student. Now, for many years, we've had football coaches filming their games in order to analyze more precisely what happened afterwards. This is essentially the same kind of thing that we are trying to do with our tape recordings in the classroom. The goal of the psychologist in this situation is to devise measuring instruments like the classification system and the consequences test, so that we can be able to first describe productive thinking, second, be able to predict who's going to be productive and who isn't, and finally, to modify the educational environment in such a way so that we can produce more effective productive thinking in the classroom.
Hundreds of children, and all of them quite different from one another. Which among them will have the special abilities that will enable them to paint a great picture, or compose a symphony, or discover a cure for a dread disease, or design a spacecraft that will carry man to a far planet and back again? One branch of psychology is devoted to studies that may tell us that someday. Studies that may help not only to recognize, but to foster intellectual qualities that in the past have developed more or less at random. And these same studies may provide us with techniques that will enable us to educate and to raise the intellectual level of all children everywhere. This is a frontier of psychology, the study of individual differences. Next week, Focus on Behavior explores social psychology. What is the power of the group over the individual? The subject, the social animal.
This is NET, National Educational Television.